Hi, welcome to Elections Weekly. I'm your host, Drew Levanti, and this is a show where we prepare for the week ahead with electional astrology, contemplating the astrology of the moment and aligning our agency with the flow of the planets. Thank you for joining again this week, or welcome for the first time. Thanks so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and telling your friends about this show. These videos come out every Monday, and this week, we're talking about a lot of Venus-Jupiter conjunction elections, which is really inspiring, and I'm so excited to get into these charts with you. Before we do that, I want to share a little bit more about Initiate, which is the learning experience that I will be offering starting at the end of June and lasting for a 7-week period. Initiate is an accelerated learning experience for electional astrology so that you can take the tools of electional astrology and start to apply them in your life. We're going to be meeting once a week for guided practice. We're going to have exercises for you to practice on your own, and we're going to have lots of group discussion talking about what is actually happening. We found the chart, what happened? Or this chart happened and this thing happened at that time. So we're going to be learning by doing. This is a very practical experience where everybody in the course is going to be sharing their own experiences, and we're going to learn from each other. I've been practicing electional astrology every day since about 2018, and it's totally enlivened my connection with the astrology of the moment, the connection with that chart of the moment, which changes hour by hour. And over the course of even just one day, you can see how these changes in the chart align with changes in what's happening. And I find this to be an incredibly spiritual practice, something where I gain deeper intimacy and connection with the planetary archetypes, with these characters in the sky that do so much to narrate my life and to narrate the life that we share. And so this is an offering that I think is really for everybody who's interested in astrology. You know, even if you're new to electional astrology, I'm going to be getting people up to speed with some of the core techniques. And so you can bring wherever you're at with your understanding of astrology into this space. You're going to have access to pre-recorded materials to help familiarize you with how we do electional astrology. And we're also going to be doing a lot of hands-on stuff together. So there's going to be people of different levels of astrological understanding in this course, and we're all going to learn from each other. So I'm really excited to share this course with y'all. The first meeting is going to be June 26th, and early registration is now open. It's open until May 2nd, so check that out. And also, I've decided to extend the scholarship applications until the end of the day this Thursday. So check out the links in the video description for registration information and also scholarship application if that applies to you. If you feel called to be in this course and you think it's right for you, please don't hesitate to apply for a scholarship if you need it. And also feel free to email me with questions. I'll also be putting my email in the video description, so just hit me up if you have any uncertainties or you're wondering if this course is right for you. So let's look at the first chart for this week. It is April 26th, Tuesday at approximately 10:05 a.m. We're looking at a Cancer rising chart here, and while the ascendant is going to be probably in mid-Cancer, somewhere in the middle of that sign, we're really looking for Venus to be conjunct the midheaven. Now, I do want to note for y'all, if you happen to be maybe somewhere in the Eastern Hemisphere, the moon is going to be a little bit close to Mars, and so you might find a slightly more advantageous election with Sagittarius rising for this election, because that'll be a little bit later. It'll pull the moon a little bit closer to Venus rather than Mars. Regardless of which of these elections you choose, this is a chart that has a lot to do with conflict resolution. And the reason for this is because the ruler of the chart, this moon in Pisces, is moving away from Mars, which is our archetype that has to do with conflict and strife and war, right? And so it has a lot to do with how we relate in ways that are uncomfortable and that bring up a lot of heat and passion and sometimes tempers flaring. And so the moon is moving away from that planet and it's moving toward Venus. And so what we're looking at here is a movement away from conflict and toward resolution. And this is in a water sign that has so much to do with healing and purifying. Like if you think about a wound that needs to be cleaned, the first thing that you're going to have is some kind of fluid or some kind of watery substance that is cleaning out that wound. And so that's what this moon in Pisces and this Venus Jupiter in conjunction in Pisces makes me think of, is this way that we can really start to let go of those conflicts and see how the ways that conflict has maybe recently transpired for you, or if you've had a fight recently, that that fight is something that is asking for integration. It's asking for whatever personal stuff was brought up from whoever was fighting, whatever that was, it's something that can be taken as a moment of integration. We don't fight for no reason. This is one of the truths of Mars, is that we need to conflict. We need to have this abrasive force in order to come into alignment with what we truly value, with what we, Venus, right? And so with this Venus-Jupiter conjunction approaching in Pisces, there's so much power in being able to hold opposites, in being able to bring together competing views on something into one whole. And that just because there's this perspective and there's that perspective, it doesn't mean that they're not part of the same overarching perspective, or there's some universal message or universal truth that can hold all of these things together and inspire us into relationships that work not only because we agree, but also because sometimes we disagree. In terms of communicating about conflict, you know, this Mercury in this chart, this is the hour of Mercury also. So I want to give Mercury a little bit of its due here. We have Mercury in this nice sextile with Jupiter, but it's also conjunct the North Node and squared by Saturn. And so what this combination of signatures says to me is that with communicating, there is often an obstacle of some kind, like there's a hurdle or some way that we feel like we can't say what we really think. This is what I see often with Mercury-Saturn aspects, where there's a tendency to say less because there's a fear or a hesitation that we might say something wrong. And when we're having open-hearted communication in a relationship of any kind, it's important to feel held and to feel safe expressing how we actually see something, to express that perspective that Mercury has so much to do with. And so with this sextile between Mercury and Jupiter, I see this as a really wonderful time to, depart that Saturnian influence, to move out of that hesitation into a more welcoming atmosphere that feels safe, that feels open, and that what we say is not a burden. There's a lot of compassion and trust that we can tune into with the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Pisces being highlighted by this moon. And also this Mercury that we're talking about is also ruled by this exalted Venus. So there's a lot of support for Mercury to overcome these hurdles and to move past these obstacles in a way that does hold these opposites and admits that multiple perspectives are possible, and it doesn't mean that either one of us is wrong. All right, our Wednesday chart for the week is April 27th at approximately 4:14 a.m. What we're looking for here is to have Venus conjunct the Ascendant. And depending on your location, the moon might be even between Venus and Jupiter, which is so, so lovely. In my location here in Chicago, I will have the moon at 26 degrees of Pisces. If you're in the Eastern Hemisphere, you might have the moon like earlier in Pisces. And that's totally fine too, because either way, it's going to be moving into this very fruitful and compassionate place where there's this Venus-Jupiter conjunction taking place. This is an incredibly creative chart. Anytime that the moon is in the first house, we want to look at what in the chart is the moon ruling. So where is Cancer in the chart, and what is the moon bringing into the first house? And here we see that it is the fifth. The Cancer is the fifth house of this chart. It rules the fifth house cusp. And so the moon is bringing in to the first house, into the center and the most important part of the election. It's bringing creativity, it's bringing sexuality and eroticism, and it's bringing beauty. This exalted Venus conjunct the ascendant with this Jupiter, there's so much to do with allure and attraction and beauty. And because it's Pisces, it can, this is an exalted Venus. This can certainly be about physical beauty, but there's also a beauty that is like an energetic beauty, or like an open-hearted beauty, something where your presence is inviting because it is welcoming. It's welcoming of difference. And so when we're thinking about this Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Pisces, we're thinking about ways that all of these things can be welcome. And there's a very protective influence of this with Jupiter. Sometimes when we're too open, we can let in things that don't belong, or we can let things in that are dangerous. With this election, though, Jupiter and Venus in Pisces, there's so much protection, and to be able to welcome those things that are aligned while being protected against things that are not. With Jupiter, I think about the way that Jupiter protects us, like on Earth. Jupiter literally, because it's so big, it protects us from asteroids and other bodies that might be dangerous to Earth. And so Jupiter actually deflects a lot of bodies that could potentially be a threat to us. And so this is part of how I understand Jupiter. It is this very protective influence. And so to have it on the ascendant with Venus and the moon, there's a lot of magnetism, but like a magnetism that is also like protecting you against things that you don't want around. And when I look at maybe the possibilities for partnership, or like beauty and this kind of open-ended approach to like what one is magnetizing, I'm looking also at the ruler of the 7th house, which is this Mercury. And Mercury is configured nicely to Jupiter and the moon, where it's in this sextile aspect. Now, it's interesting that Mercury, again, still has these challenges that it's facing with the square from Saturn in the 12th here. So speaking to some way in which Mercury might be afflicted by, hidden things or to shadowy things. And speaking of shadow, I mean, the North Node is also this source of shadow because it's where eclipses happen. It's where the light of the sun and the moon become blocked. And so when the North Node is blocking somehow this 7th house ruler, there might be something a little bit like behind the scenes, or something more shadowy or darker here. But at the same time, it's so harmonious with the 1st house that I think you and what you're offering at the time of this election is going to be supportive for that person, and their baggage or what have you is going to be something that you don't have to necessarily deal with. Like if we look at what Saturn, who is this like main affliction for Mercury, what Saturn's position is relative to the moon and Venus and Jupiter, these things don't have an aspect. Saturn does not have an aspect to these things that are happening in the 1st house. And so those more shadowy things, or those hidden things, are not necessarily an immediate concern for the 1st house. The 1st house can continue to be beautiful and to welcome in beautiful things and beautiful experiences. And those more shadowy influences are something that you might be able to connect to, or you might be able to witness, or you might have a sense they're going on because of your interaction with this 7th house party, but they're not immediately damaging to you. And you can tune into this Jupiter as like a protective influence against those things. With the Sun conjunct the 2nd house cusp, and Mercury also, ruling that 7th, and it's in the 2nd here, we are also looking at potentially some kind of like financial assistance coming in through this chart. And it's complicated, like it's nodal, it's nodal, and there's like this kind of building eclipse energy in the 2nd house of this chart. And so finances might be somehow unstable, or there's a lot happening there. But if you're looking for financial assistance from somebody who might be a somewhat shady figure or somebody who you don't entirely trust, I think this is an election where you can tune into what you have to offer and the beauty that you're offering and move forward with that kind of harmonious relationship where you can really benefit from this relationship. And so from here on out, we're looking at April 28th now, and I'm now locating these charts in San Francisco because I'm going to be in San Francisco for the next month or so, starting on Wednesday and Thursday. So this election, this Thursday, 10:25 a.m. election, we're looking at having Venus and Jupiter on the midheaven. This is the day of Jupiter, and it's the hour of Venus. So everything that I said regarding the Tuesday chart where the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was on the midheaven, this chart is even stronger in those senses of purification and open-heartedness in relationships and welcoming all that could be, welcoming those aspects of relationships that we haven't even considered, those things in relationships that are beyond what we've even imagined, and being able to attract those things even from that place of ignorance. I think so often when we're talking about boundaries in relationships, these boundaries are sometimes about past wounds, and we have boundaries around certain kinds of behaviors or certain kinds of interactions in relationships because we've been hurt in some way. And so what this Venus-Jupiter conjunction to me says is that you don't have to do relationships from a place of past hurt. You can be open to new experiences or people proving you wrong about, whatever trust issues might exist. Venus conjunct Jupiter in Pisces is a beautiful signature for trust and compassion, self-compassion, compassion for others, knowing that it's not just us who has a wound in terms of relationships, but also the person who I'm connecting with might also have those wounds. And to be able to move through that conflict, again, this Mars is still in the same sign as these two, to be able to look back on that conflict. Venus and Jupiter are almost like they're aware of Mars, but Mars is in the rearview mirror, right? And so to look back on these conflicts and these wounds, these maybe open wounds with respect to relationships, but at the same time, knowing that those wounds aren't destined necessarily to be repeated. And to continue this theme of looking back on something, looking back on a past wound or a past situation, I'm looking at the moon ruling the chart, and it's very much in its balsamic phase. It's in its last hurrah of its cycle, right? Where it's getting smaller and it's getting quieter. That light is diminishing into the newness of that moon. And so what this can be about and how we can read this is that this is the closing down of a cycle. This is also the letting go of a cycle. And in order to begin something anew, we first have to empty out. And so this Venus-Jupiter conjunction happening around the same time as this emptying out of the moon and this cleansing of the moon's light into this period of darkness where we can eventually plant new things and cultivate new Taurian things, like the coming new moon eclipse is in Taurus. This new moon or this dark moon phase that is in this election really does speak to that way in which we are letting go of things from the past. This wholly new experience with relationships, with this Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Pisces. And when I say holy, I do mean Holy. Like there's a divinity to this conjunction and an opening to the perfect, the sense of whatever happens here is exactly what is needed. And it's exactly aligned with what my soul is calling forth from partnerships. Jupiter also rules the 6th house of this chart. And so that can have to do with advocacy as well, and like organizing and supporting the downtrodden. And so this is also an election, with Venus kind of bringing her beneficence to Jupiter. This is also an excellent election for like offering support to the less fortunate, and potentially even the less fortunate who are in a foreign place. So I'm looking at Mars being in the ninth, and so showing some kind of like turmoil in the ninth, as well as Saturn conjunct the ninth house cusp. So both malefics are kind of touching the ninth in some way. And so there might be people who are struggling abroad or struggling in terms of maybe religious disputes, or they're oppressed because of their religion in some way. And so with Venus conjoining Jupiter, there's also potential for offering support for that. Friday, 4/29, April 29th, we're looking at a very, very similar chart to the previous one, with mid-Cancer rising and Venus conjoining Jupiter on the midheaven. There just isn't anything I would rather be tuning into than this Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And there's very little that is different in this chart. I will say that, at least in my location in San Francisco, this is going to be during a void moon. So for some of you, the moon is not going to be void yet. Like if you're on the East Coast of the United States, or like in an Eastern time zone in the Western Hemisphere, or you're in the Eastern Hemisphere, the moon's actually still going to be moving into an aspect with Saturn. And this is interesting because Saturn is the ruler of the seventh in this chart. And so the aspect between the moon and Saturn is an aspect between the ruler of the first and the ruler of the seventh. So this is showing some kind of sextilely, relationship between the ruler of the first and the ruler of the seventh, or like whoever the main kind of actors, or the sender and the recipient, or the proposer and the proposed, getting together here, where Saturn is in the eighth in this chart. And so there might be some way in which this other person is maybe offering some kind of resource, but it might be offered in like a hesitant way, because Saturn here is slowing down. Saturn is getting pretty slow in its cycle, getting ready to station retrograde. And Saturn is also just Saturn. Saturn doesn't like to move fast. So this could be somebody who's older and maybe reticent or hesitant in some way about resources. Meanwhile, the moon is in the 10th, it's busy, it's fast, it's in Aries. So while you have this slow Saturn, and you have this, on the other hand, you have this moon in the 10th that's showing so much activity and busyness. So there's definitely like a differential here in terms of personality being expressed here in the chart between whoever is like the primary interacting, whoever's primarily interacting here. And while you do have this Venus-Jupiter conjunction on the midheaven saying like, it's all fine, whatever goes, goes, there's like a very open-ended quality of, partnership in this situation. The moon and Saturn are very different, where they're coming at this in very different ways. And so like, how does that work out? I guess you'll have to see. Okay, now April 30th, which is the day of the eclipse. And I've chosen for this chart a Sagittarius rising with the Venus-Jupiter conjunction on the IC. And so this is something that is a bit stabilizing within a very destabilized context. Eclipses are really potent times where really important things happen. And personally, I wouldn't be working with this election for anything other than a quiet moment of restoration. A quiet moment to reflect on all the changes that are happening and to come at them from a place of preparation. Like, I am ready for all of these changes that are happening, especially if you're somebody who has a lot of fixed energy in your chart. This eclipse is going to be all over you, and so is the next one, like the lunar eclipse that will be coming up in Scorpio just a couple weeks after this chart. So with Venus and Jupiter here at the very end of Pisces, it's like these benefics, these sources of support are about to change in some way. And so being prepared for support that comes in different ways than you're used to, and maybe getting one last one last form of support in the way that you're used to, and being open to this changing. Eclipses are very confusing times often. They're very electrified times. It feels like the air is buzzing to me. And this isn't just the eclipse, but all of eclipse season. There's this, it's like there's these nodes in the atmosphere that are like buzzing and electrifying, and they bring it, it's like if you were to get like a little jolt of something, it's like, oh, like there we go, like, okay, we're going this direction now. And it's like it comes from somewhere else. And so oftentimes during eclipses, I feel like there's this propulsion forward that it's like, this is not coming from me, this is coming from my destiny, this is coming from a place of my intention that was like, it was mapped out before I got here. It was mapped out maybe even before I was born. It was mapped out when my soul entered my body, or when I was conceived, or something deep and titanically before. And this is something that requires a little bit of letting go of the reins and releasing a little bit of control, and having faith that whatever goes on here, whatever these eclipses are about, is a part of the journey. It is a part of the path here. And so I hope that we all, I hope that this path is like what we want, and that our desires are aligned, and our sense of that we feel resourced within this Taurus eclipse, and that even if resources are changing, or there's instability with respect to the food system, or money, the economy, inflation, all of these things that are happening in alignment with this Taurus eclipse, the human species is a very resilient one. We have been through a lot in the history of our many different societies and our many different cultures, and people will pull through. It's something that I deeply believe in. And so even when there are struggles and crises, even these moments of instability are not only like tests, but they are tests that we're very capable of meeting, and to embrace this ingenuity. Like, this Uranus is very close to this eclipse that is happening. And so there are going to be senses of like, whoa, the rug pulled out a little bit, and where to go from here. But at the same time, there's like an innovation and ingenuity that comes in those situations of crisis, where you have to turn on a dime, or think on your feet in some way. And so this is just something to tune into with this eclipse, and I hope this is helpful. We're going to move now into the next chart. Here we have our Sunday chart, May 1st, 10:31 p.m. with Venus and Jupiter on the IC. The eclipse is still in the air, but at this point, the moon is very close to its aspect with Venus and Jupiter. And so, if you had to choose, like, when am I gonna do something while the moon is in Taurus? Like, when am I gonna like send that email or something? I guess this would be the one, although I generally advise people to like keep it a little low key when the moon is even still in the same sign as it was eclipsed in. But with this moon in the 6th, we're looking at some emphasis on perhaps work or labor, or laboring for resources. This exalted moon in the 6th describing a need to organize for resources, and to do so successfully, especially with like this Venus-Jupiter conjunction, kind of ruling that moon, and also like receiving the light from that moon. So this is a moon that is like waxing away from the eclipse, and so there's still this sense of like instability. But if you need to do something that is like something to do with home, or stabilizing your home and your living situation within a fairly destabilized context, this is a chart that I would do for that. And I'm really excited to not be talking about eclipse charts anymore, because they are, just that extra little bit of stress, I think. Now, May 2nd is the moon in Gemini. And so we're once again looking at a Sagittarius rising chart for this. It's got Jupiter on the IC once again. We're looking for that Jupiter to be in a position of, it's like at this foundation of the chart. It's on the IC, which has so much to do with where we are rooted and giving us support from below, from the land, and from our heritage and our ancestors as well. And so with the moon here, the moon is also angular. And so it brings even greater attention to that sense of before, or that sense of where we've been, and that sense of emotional foundation as well. So the moon being in the 7th here, this is a somewhat relationship oriented chart where we might be offering support to somebody. And with Mercury also there in Gemini, this is a very communicative chart where whoever you're relating with in this chart has a lot to say and has a lot of information to share. The moon is squaring Mars here, and so if this election finds its way to you and you need something on this day, the moon squaring Mars is quite activating for emotional vulnerability, or a sense of like things being very much unstable and in motion with our living situation, or just with whatever the focus is for this election, like that moon signifying the mood. The moon is the mood. And so with the moon square Mars, there can be like, and it's immutable signs too. It's like this is changing and that is changing, and it's just like, whoa, what are we doing here? How can I find stability? How can I do these lunar things like restoring and feeding and being safe? How can I do this in a context where Mars is staring down at me and I have to think on my feet, and I have to adjust to these very heated situations that that are urgent, that require fast action. And so finding a little bit of finding calm from this Jupiter is something that this chart does have going for it, like this belief that it will all be okay in the end. Yeah, so you can hear that these elections at the end of the week do get a little bit tense, right? We have this eclipse, and then we have the moon in Gemini that square Mars. And I hope that your eclipse season brings you forward into exactly where you're meant to be. And I hope that the elections that are shared this week help you observe that way in which you are exactly where you are meant to be. So thank you for joining this week. Thank you again for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and checking out Initiate at the links below. Looking forward to seeing you all in class in a couple months if you feel so called. See you next week.